Welcome, everybody, to this roundtable panel discussion sponsored by Project Censored and the Media Freedom Foundation. It is Wednesday, January 13th. It's 3 in the afternoon Pacific time. Our event today has a panel of experts that are going to discuss how media are shaping audiences' perceptions of recent events, which include violence at the U.S. Capitol, connected to the 2020 elections, social media censorship, the related constitutional crisis, and an historic vote for a second impeachment that actually just happened earlier today. My name's Mickey Huff. I am today's moderator for this event. I am the president of the Media Freedom Foundation and director of Project Censored. I'm also a professor of social science and history at Diablo Valley College in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I co-chair the history department and also the journalism department and teach in the social justice program. My recent book with Andy Lee Roth is now out, Project Censored State of the Free Press 2021. Before that, I co-authored United States of Distraction with Nolan Higdon. Special thanks to Nolan Higdon, who really helped put the event together today. He is one of our panelists, and I will properly introduce him momentarily. So, just to get us topically going here, the past few years, the corporate establishment news media have oft analyzed Donald Trump's presidency in an historical vacuum, ignoring decades-long bipartisan embrace of neoliberalism that helped bring about his successful candidacy while focusing sensationally on his cult of reality TV personality. Such bread and circus tunnel vision misses the bigger pictures. Trump, even with all his faults, is a symptom of a much larger pattern brought by an increased privatization of the public sphere, especially in realms of education and media, which go back over half a century, particularly the past 40 years. With the continued degradation of these key pillars of our society, our civic and information literacy has suffered greatly at a time when the world has become more complex and our country more unequal. As a consequence, we become more partisan, more divided, more estranged from one another as a society. This is also part of the major thesis that Nolan Higdon and I argued in United States of Distraction. Well, as we sit here today in another historic moment, what we see again is that Donald Trump has helped peel back the gilded veneer of our so-called democracy in the United States. His presidency has revealed what neoliberalism overall has wrought, a post-democratic United States ripe for fascist tendencies. So we argue that democracy ceases to exist unless the citizenry participates in and respects the process, puts its faith in, defends public institutions, accepts verifiable electoral results, and attains critical thinking and media literacy skills necessary to make well-informed and sophisticated decisions. We cannot and should not return to normal. At this point, we are all too well aware of what normal has wrought, and I think we're well past normal, from COVID to this coup and the incitement of insurrection as the House charged Trump earlier today. So there's a lot of themes in here, and I am, of course, open to, we're having our panelists express themselves 5 to 7 minutes here in the kickoff. They're going to talk about their angles and their perspective on these issues. There likely will be some disagreement, but we're not afraid of that. And as ever at Project Censored, we're not interested in censoring anybody or censoring any issues. So again, please, I want to welcome everybody for being here. I thank all of you for coming and taking time out of your busy schedule. Please now allow me to introduce our esteemed panel participants today. In order of appearance, we welcome Manar Mahawish-Adley. She's founder and CEO and editor-in-chief of Mint Press News, regular speaker on responsible journalism, sexism, neoconservatism within media, and journalism startups. She's also the executive treasurer and host of Behind the Headlines and Mintcast podcast. Manar started her career as an independent multimedia journalist covering Midwest and national politics while focusing on civil liberties and social justice issues, posting her reporting and exclusive interviews on her blog, Mint Press, which later turned into Mint Press News. And Manar, of course, can give us a website and talk more about that. In 2009, Adley also became the first American woman to wear the hijab to anchor and report the news in American media. Manar Mahawish-Adley, welcome to our presentation.
Thank you.
Following Minar will be Robin Anderson, PhD, Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Communication and Media Studies at Fordham University. Robin also directs the Peace and Justice Studies program. Her book, A Century of Media, A Century of War, by Peter Lang Publishing in 2006, won the Alpha Sigma New Book Award for 2007. Robin's the author of dozens of book chapters and journal articles, writes media criticism for a variety of publications, including with us at Project Censored. Robin's current research explores implications of merging news and information with entertainment and fiction in media representations of war, including war-themed video games. Her article, From America's Army to Call of Duty, Doing Battle with Military Entertainment Complex, is published in Democratic Communique. Her latest articles include articles on media literacy. She's done the news abuse chapter for Project Censored. She's a regular contributor to Fairness and Accuracy and Reporting, or FAIR.org. Robin Anderson, welcome to our events today.
Great to be here. Thanks. Really important.
After Robin, we welcome Allison Butler, PhD. Allison is Senior Lecturer and Director of Undergraduate She is Senior Lecturer and Director of Undergraduate Advising Director of Media Literacy Certificate Program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Butler's research interests are focused on critical media literacy, especially teacher education in media literacy and integrating media literacy into the primary and secondary school classroom. Could not emphasize the importance of that more now. We need that so much now. Allison also co-runs the Mass Media Literacy, a grassroots organization that trains teachers in media literacy and building curriculum for critical media literacy K-12 in public schools. Butler's upper level communications classes all come with civic engagement components, where students have the opportunity to work in the community across the state and on behalf of young people with media learning. Allison works with homeschool, alternative school, public school students on media literacy education across the board. She is also involved with Action Coalition for Media Education. Most recently, she's author of Educating Media Literacy, The Need for Critical Media Literacy in Teacher Education, published by Brill 2020. Also a forthcoming text on global media literacy education. As you can see, like our other participants, Allison Butler is quite prolific and very active in the areas we'll be discussing today. Allison Butler, welcome to the conversation. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Mickey. It's great to be here.
Next on the list is we have Nicholas Baham. Nicholas Baham III is a professor of ethnic studies. Hold on, I'm sorry, momentarily I have to pull up Nick's bio again. I apologize. I do apologize, Nick. I had it on a separate sheet.
No worries.
But Nick is a professor of ethnic studies. I do know enough about Nick to give him at least a proper introduction. Nick is a professor of ethnic studies at California State University, East Bay. He's also a member of the board with us at Media Freedom Foundation. He is co-founder with Nolan Higdon of the Along the Line podcast. He is an expert in numerous fields and does study in jazz studies and various areas of history. Nick Baham, welcome to the program this afternoon. I'm very much looking forward to your participation with us today.
Thank you for having me, Mickey.
Oh, absolutely, Nick. It's always a pleasure to be in dialogue with you. Last but not least today is Dr. Nolan Higdon. He is author and university lecturer of history and media studies. Nolan's areas of concentration include youth culture, news media literacy, and critical media literacy. He's on the board of the Action Coalition of Media Education, or ACME, as well as Northwest Alliance for Alternative Media and Education. Most recent publications include United States of Distraction, that we did with City Lights, co-authored with me. And also his latest book is UC Press from 2020. It is called The Anatomy of Fake News, a critical news literacy education. He is the co-host of the Along the Lines podcast with Dr. Nicholas Baham III. He's a longtime contributor to Project Censored's annual book, Censored, and has been a contributor for Truth Out, Counterpunch, and many other outlets. And again, most recently here just this week, Nolan Higdon and I actually have an article published at Counterpunch that kind of sort of kicked off what we were going to be talking about today, this post-coup de Trump autopsy of our democracy, looking at issues around media narratives. So that said, thank you all for being with us and thank you for our proper introductions. I would now like to turn things over to our panelists and would ask that people please be mindful of a roughly 7-minute period for commentary. We will go through each person and then we will go to audience Q&A. We hope to have dialogue and discussion, maybe some debate even among panelists, and looking forward to a really great conversation. So thanks again to all of you for being here. Our first guest is Manar Mahawish Adley from Mint Press News. So Manar, please go ahead and kick things off. What are you thinking about, particularly in light of the events of last week in January 6th, but also, of course, you can open things up more generally the last several years. Manar, please take the stage.
Sure. I think in light of the events that took place last week on the Capitol, one of the things that I have actually been bringing attention to is how much I've never seen the left in my life cheer on social media censorship like they are doing today. I'm seeing people on the left and within the progressive movement cheering on Twitter's ban of Trump from tweeting on the platform and from his removal from all of the social media, what I like to call the cartels of the social media platforms. And why this is dangerous is because it's not necessarily, this is not a defense of Trump and what he stands for. It's just that social media tech giants cannot be neutral arbitrators of what is allowed and not allowed in terms of speech and what can be allowed online. These are social media tech giants that are heavily influenced by the deep state, by the national security state. They work hand in hand with very hawkish think tanks like the Atlantic Council. Twitter, for example, one of their fake news moderators is a British military intelligence officer. And so it's extremely dangerous that the left is cheering on this censorship because they don't agree with Donald Trump, when if we look at the history of social media censorship, it has actually targeted dissenters, anti-war activists, journalists. In particular, it's targeted organizations that have brought attention to US empire war crimes in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Africa, through all of the conflicts that the United States is involved in. It's censored alternative and independent media and journalism, including Mint Press, the organization that I run, organizations that bring attention to the US sanctions war regime against countries like Iran, North Korea, China, Venezuela, Cuba, and so forth. And so these, whenever social media tech giants go on to censor people on the right, it's usually being set up as a precedent to censor people on the left and censor voices that have been very outspoken against US empire and the police state. And one of the main examples I wanted to give is, the last time we saw a massive purge on social media, it started with the targeting of people like Alex Jones and his conspiracies and people on the right wing. And that actually set up a very dangerous precedent because we had mentioned, Mint Press has been at the forefront of covering social media censorship. And we were one of the first organizations to call foul and say, hey, we can't be celebrating this because if they're gonna censor people like Alex Jones, this is just setting up the stage for censoring other people who are critical of US empire. And right after that, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram purged nearly 1,000 pages that had millions and millions upon millions of followers that were not necessarily on the right or white supremacist groups or the conspiracy theory pages that Twitter and Facebook had claimed that they were targeting. These were pages, most of them were pages that were like the Free Thought Project, for example, that had millions of followers that they had built organically over the course of a couple of years. And this was one of the top pages that was bringing attention to police brutality. I mean, that was all they did, was just cover police brutality. And so Facebook and Twitter and all the social media pages purged all their social media managers, and all, and so we can't trust these organizations to play thought police, especially when they're so embedded with the national security state and the surveillance state. We have people that are that work within the Atlantic Council that literally wrote for President Bush how to go to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so these are the people that are advising these social media tech giants. And on top of that, with this whole like fake news consensus, it first started off with fake news. That was the whole thing, back in 2016 when Donald Trump was running against Hillary Clinton. At that time, WikiLeaks became a victim of a lot of this censorship as well. Whenever WikiLeaks would try to hold a press conference and connect with Facebook and so forth, WikiLeaks was targeted in censorship. And so we know that these purges and censorship and these bans are not really about targeting incitement of violence, for example, because if it truly was about that, Trump would have been banned a long time ago when he was threatening complete genocide of the Iranian people, a country of over 60 million people, when he was threatening that on Twitter, when he was threatening nuclear warfare with North Korea. What about Obama or Hillary Clinton when they were on Twitter and on Facebook promoting regime change in Syria and promoting the US war machine across Africa and NATO warfare under the guise of the war on terror? So this really is not about inciting violence. This is because the left and the progressive class and the establishment Democratic class was very much okay with those kinds of tweets. Even I remember Marco Rubio threatened to give Maduro the same fate as Muammar Gaddafi, to be killed and assassinated with like a machete. He said that blatantly on Twitter, and he was never censored or banned. That kind of rhetoric is okay because it promotes US empire and warfare. So this is definitely not about Trump inciting violence. And in fact, if you actually look at the tweets, and again, we're not here to defend Trump and what he stands for, but if you actually look at the tweets that he was banned for, he was actually telling the people at the Capitol, go home in peace. There was no inciting of violence in those tweets whatsoever. So there is definitely an agenda here at play. And I just want to point out that a lot of this rhetoric and a lot of this driving force to bring the left to support censorship is part of a neoliberal agenda to divide the people. It is a distraction for the issues that people are facing every single day. Like, Mickey, you had presented that at the very beginning very, very well, that Trump is really just a symptom of actually a neoliberal agenda of issues that have been diseasing our society. And so that's really what it comes down to, and that's why it's been a politicization ever since.
Thank you for kicking things off for us today, Minar. And I know you may have to leave sooner than the others, but I want to thank you for all the work you do at Mint Press News and Behind the Headlines. And thanks for joining us today. I hope you can stay as long as you can. Our next speaker is Dr. Nicholas Baham III, and I would like to at least take a moment to briefly, properly introduce Nick to you all. Professor of Ethnic Studies at California State University, East Bay, teaches courses in Black Studies and Genders and Sexualities in Communities of Color. Nick's academic research focuses on African-American religious experience, alternative Black sexualities, jazz studies, James Baldwin, and Afrofuturism. His book, The Coltrane Church, Apostles of Sound, Agents of Social Justice, published in 2015 by McFarland Press. Nick has published numerous academic journal articles and has spoken around the world. He also has appeared on BET, KPFA, Canada's Sex TV. He's also appeared in Color Lines and Esquire magazine. He has a blog of African-American politics and culture called The Upper Room at nicholasbaham.blogspot.com. With that, Dr. Nicholas Baham III, thank you so much for joining us today. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Mickey. I have a slightly different perspective because of my training in social cultural anthropology and also my work as a Black Studies scholar. But I think that it's some of the points that I'm going to raise do definitely intersect with the critique of neoliberalism and also the critique of media that will be offered here for the most part. So, when events like the storming of the Capitol happen, for me, I'm always I'm looking for a particular source to understand this. And in watching it, I couldn't help but sort of go back to my early training in reading Victor Turner's work. Turner used to talk about how a single cultural event has all of these different symbols that converge, and that a deep analysis of those symbols kind of reveals a lot about the history of that particular group, cultural, social patterns going forward, etc. So when I'm looking at shirts that say Camp Auschwitz, Arbeit macht frei, I'm looking at Confederate flags, I'm looking at a shirt that says 6 million is not enough, I'm looking at nooses. I think, Mickey, you've earlier spoken to references to the Turner diaries. There's a lot of stuff that happened in terms of symbols in that moment. Everything I can see sort of an echoing back to the Whiskey Rebellion or Shays Rebellion, but I can also see, for example, the Oklahoma City bombings. I can also see what former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger referred to as Kristallnacht, or frankly, even the burning of the Reichstag fire. But I can also see the Tulsa riots. I also see a lynch mob in that. And for me, my main analysis of this is that the events that happened with the storming of the Capitol, the Trump insurrection, reflect a broader crisis of whiteness that we're experiencing in our country. I think it's entirely compatible with the analysis that you guys, and particularly what Manar has offered around neoliberalism, because this is a group of people since our independence, again, going back to the Whiskey Rebellion and Shays Rebellion, who have been continually lied to, who have been continually sold this notion of white supremacy. And yet at the same time, they don't get to eat at the same table as the real white supremacists in our country, the Mitch McConnells, et cetera, of our country, the folks who own Twitter or Facebook, or any of these giant corporations that control our society. But that is by and large how I read that particular event. And I do appreciate those members of the House today who addressed white supremacy. I took note of the sharp reaction from by the right to that. I also took note of the manipulation of that rhetoric by the left. But people of color standing up in the House of Representatives, speaking to this issue, this is significant. I think America is still dealing with its central problem and its original sin, and that is the original sin of race. And the lie that white people have been told is not just the lie that Donald Trump won this election and he was cheated out of it. The lie that continues to be told to white America is that white people are superior by nature and are therefore destined to have more than anyone else. And I understand how these people are looking at the things that are happening in our society, particularly, I think COVID has exacerbated this to a large extent. How they're looking at this and saying, that power, whatever little amount of it that I had is slipping away. Arguably, most of the people who are demonstrating here have neither a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. And I think they're growing in consciousness about that. But the Trump regime has helped to put it within the framing of what people of color have. I think that Barack Obama, I think Kamala Harris have helped those folks to understand, or at least to think of this in terms of what people of color have and compared to what they do not have. And that's pretty much how I read this event. I would just appreciate deeper analysis of this in our media, which continually lets us down and deals with race on a very surface level and doesn't connect it with some of the other things that, for example, Manar has been talking about here with respect to neoliberalism and the consistent lies that have been told to white people for hundreds of years in this country. So thank you, Mickey.
Dr. Nicholas Baham III, thanks so much for your comments. We look forward to continuing the conversation once we get through the panel and get into the Q&A. So thanks again for your insights. Robin Anderson, you are up next. I'm sorry that I said we were going alphabetically and then I lied and skipped over to Nick. So
Okay.
I checked my alphabet and I realized that A is before B, and I'm now going back to you. So Robin Anderson, professor and director of graduate studies, Department of Communications, Media Studies at Fordham, longtime writer for FAIR, contributor to Project Censored. I know you have a lot to say about this, so please take the stage.
Yep. The comments so far have just been terrific. And I'd like to agree with Nick and go off from there. I think we've all lived through an amazing set of images, an amazing amount of media coverage that is just exploded on our television screens and all through the press, complete with, oh my gosh, how did we ever know that this wasn't happening? How could we have been so caught unaware? And how come we didn't have police presence that could stop these people? And how did our senators and our Congress people become actually afraid for their lives in the Capitol building? I think the point that I want to make about the media is that they haven't prepared us. They didn't prepare the American public all through the time of Trump, right up through the election, right to the election. We've written in FAIR about how they refused to call out Trump and all the legal suits as attempts to actually steal the election. They refused, a number of people have written about this, from The Nation to Bill McKibben, to Steve Zunis. They are not talking about there's a potential coup here. And all of those things kind of were simmering in the background until January 6th. And then they even didn't know what to do. On NPR, I was listening to NPR, and they were talking about, Mary Louise Kelly was actually saying, what do you think of these concerns that we have now? So the first thing that I heard was a concern. This was at 4:00 in the afternoon. Pro-Trump protesters, then they went to that. I must say Joe Biden actually said, these are terrorists. I've showed this. Amazing about the images of race. I've showed this picture to my granddaughter, and she says, look at the difference between the militarization of the Capitol when the Black Lives Matter people were there, and this these police were unprepared, left to hang out to dry. Many of them also were seen milling around with the rioters, taking selfies, and in general, what do you call them? So as the days went past, we got more and more imagery of the absolute depravity and lack of direction of what these people did. One National Geographic photographer that was with them said they got into the Capitol and they didn't know what to do. They kind of looked around and said, wow. And every time you thought the bottom, you'd reach the lowest level with the reports of what had happened, about how they were chasing around the senators and the Congress people, how they were actually looking for Mike Pence and saying, hang Mike Pence. They were really, one person said they really wanted to shoot Nancy Pelosi on live television. And just as you thought you couldn't get any lower, the bottom would drop out again. And then you'd hear, well, they crapped all over the Capitol building and they tracked it all over. So what do you call these people? Are they rioters? Are they mobs? Are they seditionists? Are they conspirators? Are they insurrectionists? And I think that basically we'll be talking about this and kind of come up for a definition for a long time. But as this coverage went on, the media frame opened up. and media had to move, especially in the network and mainstream media, NPR, they had to move away from this media frame where the Republicans and the Democrats have to come together. They have to unify this beltway encapsulation of our politics seen through the eyes of this two-party politics. And now, oh, we've been so polarized and now we need to get together. What the images showed us was who these people were that are now directing and guiding the leaders of the Republican Party, because that is the only base they have left. As we've been talking about, there really is, they've been doing all of this throughout Trump's reign of violence and the QAnon and the conspiracy theories. And now we're actually, the Republican Party, we finally realized, is beholding to a group of people who actually really go back to things like Gnostic Christians who believe that that the world that we see is not real, but they've got to dig down and find the truth. It's like this is the deep state. There are things going on that none of us know about, and it's a song and that we've heard before. You know, the QAnon conspiracy of the Democrats cannibalizing children, and Trump is their savior. These kinds of things are beyond the rational. They're cult members. They're absolutely not part of a discourse that can be even thought of as citizenship, constituencies, anything like that. And yet media have been telling us that Trump has this legitimate base of people who have their grievances, and we need to keep listening to them. And I think Nick is absolutely right that what we saw, what the truth was these were an amalgam of just deluded brutality that now that has been tracked for years by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And just one more example of when they were watching the live cam of storming the building, they were saying, hang the congressman, give them the ropes. And that is right out of the Turner Diaries, where the terrorists, written by a white supremacist, about a dystopian group of people who basically kill everyone and hang them, including journalists and politicians. And as people were watching that, they were saying, hang the congressman, give them the rope. So this is who they are. So as media struggled to get back to this beltway politics, it's been fascinating to watch that media frame not be able to explain things, the cognitive dissonance on the part of the journalists themselves, where tonight on NPR, after the vote was taken to impeach Trump the second time, they literally said, I don't know what to make of this. There seems to be no common ground anymore. Of course not. Democratic senators and congressmen were hiding for their lives in our Capitol building, based on white privilege, skipping through to a number to get to the end point, white privilege in a party that represents that, and a media that have not called it out and explain to us that this is not something that, well, they have to be so careful because they're going to be challenged in primary battles. It's not party above duty, as they've been saying. This is about democracy against fascism. And they are incapable of understanding that because they don't understand because of their own clamped on media stilted frame that only sees the Republicans and this movement as legitimate when they are not. We've got now threatened attacks in 50 state capitals. They're talking about coming in great numbers during this. I mean, this people are kind of beyond it. So I think with that, I will stop my rant. Thank you.
Robin Anderson, thanks so much. It's always good to hear what's on your mind. There's always a lot on it, and looking forward to hearing more as we move along. Dr. Allison Butler, you are next. If we had a group of super friends in critical media literacy, you would be among the leaders as far as critical media literacy education. You've done so much for so many years, training teachers, the work that you do with us at Project Censored as well. We're really honored to have you and definitely looking forward to your remarks. So Allison Butler, you have the stage.
Great, thank you so much. I really do wish I was coming at this. Part of me wishes I was coming at this a little bit more organized, but part of me is saying like, no, this is such a chaotic thing that's happening. And I'm trying to kind of tack it back and forth between the kind of chaos, certainly the feeling of isolation, because this is, I think, as Nick said, sort of exacerbated by COVID, just that inability to kind of be with folks as going through this. I mean, I watched all of this like so many other people on TV with the computer by myself, right? I mean, that's just sort of it changes the narrative a little bit. I really thank you so much for having me. This is such a amazing group of people. And I could really easily just sit here one sentence and say, yeah, what they said, because it's just so phenomenal. But like I said, I've remained largely messy in my thoughts over the past week. I've tried really hard to bring my own responses into a critical media literacy frame, and away from my own emotions or my own personal interests. That's been really tough. Today, certainly this evening, I'm on the East Coast, so it's about 6:45 here. In some ways, the day is sort of done, but is it really? It's a culmination of a week of 4 years of decades of a rapidly changing media environment, a rapidly changing news environment. I have this moment of nostalgia. Remember when news was only on your front stoop in the morning, and on TV in the evenings, neatly divided out between local, national, and world news? I know it was never really like that, but it's a kind of nice nostalgia. If anyone is feeling exhausted, no kidding. I find myself forgetting so many of the atrocities from this administration because there are just so many of them. And I don't think that my forgetting is an accident. I think that absolutely serves the mainstream media to have so much chaos, because then we're glued to our devices. This, to me, is in some ways the embodiment of neoliberalism. We are invited to see these stories over and over and over again, but with very little context provided. And I think that that's risky. Similar to 9/11, and this certainly echoes some of what my fellow panelists have said. The reporters, the anchors, the talking heads, the journalists, etc., were all scrambling to find the words to talk about what was happening. This contributed, I think, in a minor way to the chaos of the day. Clearly, the chaos of the day was very much at the Capitol, but it will probably take weeks, months, years to really be ironed out. History will codify the language, and then there will be another round of analysis that will readdress the language. Were these people protesters, terrorists, rioters, insurrectionists, anarchists, patriots, angry Americans? I feel like I've heard all of the above. Also, similar to 9/11, the talking heads all seemed, Robin, you mentioned this too, caught unawares, right? Have no idea how to talk live about what was happening. The immediate word choices, however, I think paled in comparison to the visual language on display. Nick, as you mentioned, the Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt, the instant memeability of the shirtless man in face paint and horns, the sea of MAGA paraphernalia and Americana repurposed as costume and performance. Certainly the noose and the gallows were just, it was nauseating. The smashing of seemingly random objects outside of the Capitol, and those selfies inside the Capitol, inside the Senate chamber, and in people's offices. So many selfies. Can it be mentioned too many times, or will it never be enough how white and male this whole thing was? And I think this needs to be part of the larger discussion: the presence, the representation, the language used by participants, as well as by those covering them. In my viewing, it was overwhelmingly white men, with a lesser number of white women, some with children in tow, but many, at least to me, who appeared to be alone. And I think that's going to take a long time to really kind of get into and unpack and look at those layers of this white privilege. The so-called good media, and I use that in air quotes, although I usually find air quotes to be super irritating. These media that have mainstream reputations as being responsible, they all have online paywalls. The more mono-focused, hyper-conservative media seem to let anyone in for free. So if you live in a community with limited media options and maybe a limited personality, there is a certain logic to being misinformed on a regular basis, right? You might think that you're informed, but with that really limited slice, maybe not so much. In a media environment where local news across the country is given roughly the same script to follow, now would be a great time for mainstream media outlets to be self-reflective. That self-reflection will demand, among many other things, that the corporate parents begin to care less about profit, which, not sure if that's going to happen anytime soon. Back in the day, news organizations weren't perfect by any means, but they were allowed to not have to care about profit. The combo of Fox News and cable news, I think, really turned that narrative around. And if I'm not mistaken, Fox News posts the highest profit in the whole Fox corporation, which I think sort of speaks volumes about where their priorities are. There seem to be so many organizations, companies, individuals, etc. 11th hour, as far as I'm concerned, it's too little too late, distancing themselves from the brand that is this current administration. But how much of that is going to be public relations and how much of it is actual disgust? And if it's actual disgust, what took you so long? It's clear post January 6th, post 1/6, that the language of white supremacy and white nationalism and anti-Semitism is unpalatable. But evidently, it seems that the language and action of assault against women, of people of color over the years, that seems to be okay. The language of white nationalism and white supremacy and anti-Semitism is believed to carry a negative association, one that's going to harm profit. So now is the time to make these choices seems a little suspect to me. I wonder if it's a case of getting brave at the last minute. All of the resignations, all of the we're not going to support this anymore, don't really mean that much to me, at least for the folks in the administration. They were out of a job in a couple weeks, a deadline they were quite familiar with. How is this anything other than giving their 2 weeks notice? They've already been lining up new work, most likely book contracts and speaking tours. They were just publicly announcing what was already happening and got to avoid being responsible for anything like a vote against the brand. The folks at the Capitol, I think, are sad and angry and frustrated and made really appalling choices. But I do wonder, going back to what I said a moment ago, how much of that might stem from a severely limited media diet and a lack of critical thinking or critical questioning. In a weird way, I feel for these folks. I too feel that America is changing, that things are being taken away from us, that things are moving too quickly, and that there absolutely were problems with the election. Only I'm pretty confident that my location for and response to those fears is remarkably different. To me, this seems like the place for critical media literacy to intervene. But I would also want to add a caution into that we need to do it in such a way, we need to bring critical media literacy in such a way that it doesn't get immediately labeled as like some sort of liberal woo-wooism, because as soon as it's got that label, the conversation is effectively over and we all go back to our silos. And while my personal silo feels really safe and really comfortable, it's a civics and civil rights disaster because education and learning don't thrive in a silo. Whatever's in the silo just kind of sits there. We're not going to eradicate racism or hate or anger. I think those are going to be there. But imagine if racism, hate, and anger had more opportunities to be diffused rather than inflamed. So I would say that I'm less concerned with answers and I'm kind of okay with my own confusion. Absolutely, I'm looking forward to the day where I can make this into a clear narrative, or more likely read a clear narrative constructed by a trusted source. But right now, I'm less concerned with the answers and more concerned with asking more questions. I'm willing to stay a bit frustrated. I'm willing to stay a bit confused. It's a pretty familiar state these days. If we can make the asking of questions a bit more normalized as part of our classroom media and personal work, that's my jam on this. So thank you.
Dr. Allison Butler, thanks so much for your comments, senior lecturer at University of Massachusetts Amherst. All your work with ACME and the work you do with this Media Freedom Foundation, all greatly appreciated. By the way, any one of the panelists, if you would like to put any links, information, contacts websites, any of that kind of stuff. I'm doing a little bit of it. If you want to put any of that into the chat room for when we save this so people can go and find more of the work that you all do, that'd be appreciated. So thanks, Allison. Next up, to last but certainly not least, the chief instigator of today's happenings, that called up the other day and said, we've got to do something about this. That's a really big question. Dr. Nolan Higdon joins us, author of The Anatomy of Fake News, critical media literacy scholar and historian. Also, you have the podcast with Nick Baham along the line. Nolan Higdon, I know you're thinking a lot about the recent events at the Capitol through today. Of course, you and I have been thinking about these for quite a while. Our article at Counterpunch is a post-coup to Trump autopsy of American democracy, facing the reality of what neoliberalism has wrought. That should be published tomorrow at counterpunch.org. Nolan Higdon, please take the stage.
Thank you very much. It's cool to be a part of a panel with such great voices and experts and friendly faces and all that. Much of what I, intended to say has been said, but there's a couple points I want to really emphasize. And, I think it's worth kind of reminding ourselves about that old sort of saying about the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And so I take quite a broad analysis when I look at these events. I like to put them in the context of the last, 30 or 40 years. And I know to quote unquote, go back to brunch or to go back to 2015. And I would argue spent too much time at brunch, and, where we were in 2015 was largely responsible for how we got here. So I think we need to think broadly about changing our own individual behavior and also changing the structures of our society. And this fixation on Trump, I think, is really problematic. Now, there's a vested interest in media all about Trump all the time, but I think that's to miss the forest for the trees there. And I keep using this analogy that I hear a lot of people in the United States kind of talk like the United Kingdom did at the end of World War II, which is, once Trump is over, once the war is over, we'll be back in power. But the rest of the world has moved on in a lot of ways. And so I think the United States and its people need to do a lot of self-reflection of kind of where we are at in this moment and how we're perceived around the world. And that could give us some perspective on why returning to 2015 might not be the best approach. Having said all that, I'm interested in kind of, like Allison said, asking questions. I'm interested in identifying the causes of this moment and not allowing myself to fall into these kind of grand media narratives where we treat large portions of the population as monoliths. I think we need to have a more sophisticated and nuanced conversation about the American people. Democracies are predicated on participation. We know we have 100 million people who are disproportionately women, people of colors, who tell pollsters they don't vote because they don't think they have a party that represents them. We also know that there's frustration with the system. Obviously, during Trump, we saw a lot of people out in the streets, but there's also frustration with the system before Trump. Look at the Bernie Sanders campaign, look at the Tea Party, look at Black Lives Matter, look at Occupy, go back to the 99 protests in Seattle. There's been a lot of frustration with the system. And I think that's crucial to pay attention to, because there's been obviously white supremacy, unfortunately, as American as apple pie. It's always been baked into the American experience. For most of American history, most of modern history, we've been able to keep that very strong element somewhat at bay, but for some reason now, and in the last 40 or 50 years, there's been folks who've been willing to align with white supremacists in these elections. I think that's kind of the crucial question. What drove some of these voters to a frustration point that they're willing to align with a president who speaks to white supremacy? And these are not all just white folks, right? Trump took in as much of the Latinx vote as the last previous Republican presidents, about a third of that vote, according to exit polls. 13% of Trump voters in 2016 voted for Obama, according to some accounts. So what is it that drove those folks to vote with Trump, despite all his faults? I share the finger wagging at the Trump administration and his behavior that most in media do. But then we have to ask ourselves, how bad must the Democrats be that people would align themselves with, right? The Democrats had their lowest approval rating in history in 2014, when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House and Joe Biden was Vice President. And after losing both houses of Congress and the presidency in 2016, they've now put Nancy Pelosi back as Speaker and the former Vice President as President. Again, is this insanity? So I think those are some of the questions I'm kind of interested in diving into. I also think that at least when I was in school and I heard about McCarthyism and Hollywood blacklisting, I recognized that the people behind that thought they were fighting against authoritarianism, but I didn't see it as an inspirational tale. I saw it as a poor way to go about addressing the threat of authoritarianism. And so I really would like to have a conversation and question folks who believe that we can somehow censor or vote our way this problem. I think we need a much deeper structural analysis when we look at this. And I think part of that is reframing and restructuring our education and media system to focus on strengthening our democracy rather than maintaining the market or the status quo. So that's kind of where I'd like to start the conversation. Thank you.
Nolan, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for all the work that you do. And I want to stress, a really important point for me here. And I see, thankfully, we have a couple people chiming in. We're going to go ahead and include these comments to our panelists. But I wanted to point out that all of us here on the panel today, and I know likely many of you are as well, but all of us on the panel today are educators. We all teach from the junior college to a state college to university. Allison Butler does a lot of K-12 development of curriculum and training of teachers. So for all of us, I think, I don't speak for all of us normally. You're all happily shaking your heads. Yes, thank you. Don't speak for me. But I think we all agree that education is such a core component of what we do about our current situation. And it's taken the last 40, 50 years to get us here to a hyper-partisan culture and society, a mediated society. We need critical thinking, civic and media literacy now as a major national priority. And I think everybody here today kind of agrees with that. And I'd like to move into the more participatory state here. I'm not going to take up too much time here. I want to get to the commentary of the lovely people that have joined us here. Thank you again. This event will be posted at www.projectcensored.org. So please follow up on that. And if you aren't part of our mailing list, please feel free to sign up for it. That way you can keep track. We'll be doing several of these throughout the year, I can assure you, including another media literacy conference that Nolan will be doing. So Rebecca Jackson asks, how does, and any panelist want to take this, how does live streaming factor into the experience of national events, cultural upheaval, and what are the critical media skills needed to contend with a saturated live reporting landscape? Additionally, to what degree is fluency in critical race theory and gender theory needed to effective media literacy? And Rebecca, before our panelists jump in, I want to say that I co-teach a course on Introduction to Social Justice Studies that actually integrates. I teach it with Professor Albert Ponce, political scientist, and the whole class fuses race theory, gender theory, and critical media literacy. So we'd actually be delighted to share the curriculum and share syllabi, and I'll make sure I put my contact info in there. But who else wants to address Rebecca's really great questions? Who's first? Allison, you want to go?
Well, the live streaming thing is curious to me because I think if it were up to me, I would handle the live streaming thing sort of in two different ways. A live streaming conversation about it, but if possible, also recording it so that, because I think one of the things that happens with our current media environment, certainly live streaming, social media, etc., is it's so rapid, it's so fast, it's so constant that we're really encouraged to just just do headlines, just do that moment, just do that pick. So while the live streaming is important to analyze, if we could take the time and say, for argument's sake, record the live stream and then go through it slowly, and really take apart the language and take apart the images. Go counter to what our current media environment invites us to do, which is to go really quickly and to just stay on that superficial level. I would actually like us to, in a way, do less, because I think by trying to tackle it all and trying to tackle it all right now, we lose a lot of that context. We lose self-reflection, and we lose the ability to sort of dig deeper into it. So that would be my thought. In terms of the ideas of critical race theory and critical gender theory, absolutely 100%. I think one concern that Nolan and I have talked about a lot with media literacy and critical media literacy is that it's largely, at least the most cited authors are white. And we need to do some self-reflection, and we need to do some work and say, which scholars of color are we ignoring or unaware of, and thereby ignoring, and how can we shift that environment?
Nick, Robin, would you like to come in here? Nick?
Well, just on, first of all, I want to second everything that folks are saying on the integration in particular of critical race studies. But I do want to mention that our media completely misunderstands critical race studies. So if you're looking for any kind of an introduction to this in mass media, every single definition of it that's ever been offered that I've seen over the past several months, certainly since the murder of George Floyd, is completely inaccurate. We've heard that critical race studies is the study of why people of color hate white people. I mean, that is just a ridiculous description. I don't think people really understand the depth of analysis offered in critical race studies. And what we're talking about here, I'm sure the person who asked the question understands this, but what we are talking about here is a study of race and racism within the law, within institutions in our society. It is not a, this is why we hate white people piece. I often get accused of this all the time just by virtue of teaching African-American studies. The other thing is that, and I don't know if this is really related to live stream, but one of the things that has struck me over, I guess, since the murder of George Floyd, is that there are a few facts all of the sudden that we can actually all agree upon. And we have some of those facts because of citizen journalists who were willing to turn on their cell phone cameras and let it roll. So what happened over the summer happened because finally many of us could agree, yes, Black people are murdered by the police. We didn't just get a shot of someone lying in their own blood on the street or the end of a particular interaction. We got to see, thanks to a young woman who should remain unnamed to protect herself, we got to see a man being pulled out of his car, so sort of from the first moment of police contact to his death. I think we can all agree on some level that's a murder. Even if you enjoy that murder, and many did celebrate that murder, we all understand that that's a murder. COVID is interesting to me because I think we can all on some level now agree, in spite of the lies that have been told around COVID, we can all agree, hey, grandma died, or somebody in our family died, somebody we know died, somebody we know has it. It actually does exist. And I'm also thinking and wondering if what happened in this moment of insurrection, if just based on the sort of citizen journalism there, citizens actually filming it, if we can't agree as a society that something violent happened here, even if we don't agree what that was all about. And so I'm sort of interested as we go forward, now that we have at least three big things that we can agree, I guess because of citizen journalists to some degree, that actually happened, what we can do, how we can dialogue around things that we at least agree happened.
Excellent points, Nick. Robin, do you want to come in here?
Yeah, I'm thinking of, it does take some background to some foundation in education to make some sense of the images, certainly, but sometimes the images are so stark because of, I think, the bravery of people, and I'm thinking of Black Lives Matter, who put themselves in front of the most militarized violence machine that our country could offer them, in DC, in the summer, and they stood up to those people. They stood up to them, and you couldn't see those images of the selfies with the cops and the white privilege without just having it slap you in the face of the difference. And I think that the Black Lives Matter activists, and Elie Mystal has said, look, we've done everything. We've educated, we've documented, we've borne witness, we've created policy, and you just won't stop this, until those people went into the street and George Floyd, after the death of George Floyd, and really started doing this. I think that that those images wouldn't have, on January 6th, wouldn't have been met with the massive contradiction of everybody had that not happened. The horrible media language and discourse that we've heard for the last 2 days, and from the Republicans, ever, these instigators, and they're much more than complicit. If they won't wear masks thinking of COVID, and they are the worst element of these people, and they are in the halls of power. They're the fascists sitting at the desk rather than the fascists trying to storm the Capitol. But if we constantly, for 2 days, we've heard them trying to make it equivalent to Black Lives Matter, that the whataboutism, oh yeah, they were really terrible, and they really challenged the government, but what about what Black Lives Matter did, and they destroyed property, and these false equivalencies of the media frame really have to be understood and taught at the level of heroic media literacy educators, for you to watch those things and on your own see through the images in that way.
So Robin Anderson, thank you for chiming in on these important issues. Nolan Higdon, I want to go back to you and a segue both on this previous comment, which I know you easily have stuff to say on, but also Ken Jenkins mentioned that none of us have specifically alluded. We've alluded. We've done plenty of alluding, more than enough, in fact. But we haven't used the word authoritarian or authoritarianism to kind of describe this whole phenomenon of what we're seeing right now. And, neoliberalism has a really sort of bureaucratic, muted, slow motion authoritarian tendency. It's been like a slow motion juggernaut through the 20th century in a lot of ways. And, as Lao Tzu once wrote, if you do not change direction, you may end up where you are heading. None of this has happened overnight. So Nolan Higdon, your thoughts, both either previously on Rebecca's commentary or on this issue of authoritarianism in general?
Yeah, and I think I have a way to kind of connect the two. Going back to what Nick said a moment ago about the misrepresented critical race theory in media, I think that's a really important point to emphasize, in that these critical frameworks, whether it be gender or race, they help take the blinders of privilege off. So they help us understand how to analyze stories from different perspectives. And at this point about authoritarianism, I think we've sort of, it's been kind of a subtext of our conversation, but this is why we need to emphasize democracy in that sense, that, we run the risk of, without democracy, it may be a system, right? But it's better than all the rest that have been tried from time to time. And so in that sense, we should be fighting for democracy. And we talk about the ways in which democracies are threatened. It's when people don't have faith in the system. That's why I never liked the discourses around democracy is on the ballot. If half the country or a substantial portion doesn't believe in the democratic process or doesn't accept we don't have a democracy. Democracy is predicated on us all having this agreement about the outcome, whether we like it or not. And so that's why issues like fake news are so crucial to people to believe that the election was stolen. But also, I think we should take really seriously the different identity groups, whether they be Trump voters or people of color, or any other group that thinks that they are that they think the system does not serve them. Because generally, an explosion of identity politics means that groups feel, either for good reason or non, that they're not being respected by the system. And so we can't just kind of for having these complaints. We need to seriously analyze where these issues come from. And so in that way, and I think to strengthen democracy, to ignore it gets us further to authoritarianism.
Thank you, Nolan. John Duvall has written, talking about racism and economic inequality have always been with us through the three quarters of the past century. It can be argued that there was slow but steady progress. John, you write, now what is different now and coming to a head is that economic contraction is adversely affecting marginalized populations disproportionately, and also poor whites. You cite sociologist Peter Turchin as documented how times of economic decline increase friction between disadvantaged sectors of society. That kind of connects with Peter Phillips. Welcome, Peter, mentor, former director of Project Censored, author of Giants, the Global Power Elite. Peter, you write about Trumpism allowing the global elite and the 0.01% to massively concentrate capital. So the importance of class here. The working precariat are indeed they're becoming more and more insecure. Mostly white, they blame people of color and are ready to fight for privileges. Failure to understand how this massive wealth is being basically taken. This 0.01% is essentially stealing the commonwealth. And you also are pointing out the failure of education. And you end by saying we need to expound on how 200 people, and this is based on your research in your book, now control over $50 trillion in capital, and how governments, are doing whatever they can to protect wealth and the wealthy. So anybody want to chime in on John or Peter's commentary? Anybody want to talk more about intersectionality or class in particular? Please feel free. Anybody? Nick, you look like you're jumping in. Robin?
Nick?
Robin, I'll let you go first on this one.
In terms of intersectionality, I'm just thinking of a tweet from Caitlin Johnston, who writes for Mint Press 2. And she said, if you want to stop conspiracy theories, stop killing people, stop the war state, stop only upholding corporate interests. All of the things that we've been talking about lead to this kind of thinking. White people have had privilege. It's been stolen. I saw that for 30 years, white people have remained about the same in terms of where they're at socially. But on the other hand, they've seen some people of color come up the ladder. That's what they don't like, in addition to the transfer of wealth to global capital. Certainly that is part of it. And it breeds this kind of thinking and this kind of violence. And we're going to be experiencing that as we continue to not address, to still give, trillions of dollars to the military, not address climate change, and not address the last extraction of every bit of natural resources we have on the globe in communities around the globe who are on the front lines of that and being destroyed and being killed by state forces in those countries.
Mickey, there is there's a question in the chat that's very much related to Peter's comments.
Yes,
And
please.
I wouldn't mind sort of trying to start to tackle that, if you wouldn't mind reading that.
I'm sorry, Nick. It's by whom?
Walton?
Yes, I have it. I'm struck the most significant and likely the root problem in relation to democracy and its healthy functioning and authoritarianism is the seductive and addictive narrative of white supremacy. So Walton asks, how do we in our teaching identify its working, demystify it, and deconstruct white supremacy so that our neighbors relinquish it as an ideology? Nick, please.
Well, I think you guys have gone a long way in this discussion towards talking about how neoliberalism manipulates ideologies of race. I would say also neoconservatism, the same. If it needs to be distinguished from Clinton era neoliberalism and Obama era neoliberalism, I would also add Reaganism to this, and I would also add neo-fascism. All of these is ideologies that that manipulate race. Our country needs I think Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called for this in his text, Where Do We Go From Here? He called for a radical restructuring of our society, of the economic system in our society. When I look at what happened in the storming of the Capitol, there's also a point in there where you say, okay, does this also look like the beginning of the French Revolution? Does this also look like a point where those who have been told to eat cake finally say, you know what, I've had enough of it? I don't agree with the racial perspectives of any of those individuals who stormed the Capitol. But I think that from what we saw in the summer in Black Lives Matter, there is a strange relationship between the anger of the voiceless that we saw on those streets with respect to the murders of Black people through state violence as a means of suppressing their economic desires, their desires for social justice, and what we saw in the storming of the Capitol. This group of people who have been lied to as a way to appease their very real economic and social interests as well. I also think that this is a country that needs a deep era of truth and reconciliation, where we can speak truth to these things. We can speak truth to the myths of race, and how race and gender and sexual identity, et cetera, have been manipulated in order to create this system. Because we do know one thing as a clear fact: all that has happened, whether we're talking about Reaganism or Bush neoconservatism or Clinton and Obama neoliberalism, all that has happened is that wealth has become more and more and more and more concentrated. It did not stop during any of those administrations. It has continued in an upward arc through all of them. I think we can agree that building a little half piece of a wall didn't stop the concentration of wealth. The Trump people were lied to. Those people were actually at that Capitol fighting on behalf of a figure who has lied to them and betrayed them and made them even more poor and created less access to resources that they need, again, particularly in the era of COVID, and left them there to die. I mean, in effect, I think one of the most poignant moments of that whole storming of the Capitol was Trump saying, I'm going to walk you to the Capitol, and then in a cowardly fashion, going right back to the White House to watch it on television and tweet about it, and letting them down. They've always been let down since the founding of this country, as the rest of us have always been let down. So for me, how to dismantle this? Radical restructuring of the economic system in our country, which is, I don't know how that's going to take place. I hope that it is bloodless, and also deep truth and reconciliation.
Anybody else want to chime in there? Allison, you want to comment?
Yeah, I was just looking some stuff up that I wanted to respond to Walton's question about in our teaching, identify its working, demystify it. One of the things that I've done with students over the years, I mean, I live in Western Massachusetts. The our population of the state is 85% white. Our population at UMass is 85% white. For many of our students, when they come to UMass, it is their first time out of a community that's 99% white. So really kind of trying to take apart white supremacy, I don't think can happen, especially being taught by a white woman, can't happen in a lecture, and it can't happen in a telling them of something. I try and kind of sneak it in at different times. And one of the things that I found to be really, really helpful for students is this is not brand new. It's Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking the Invisible Backpack. I can put up a link to the PDF. It's really easy to find. There's a lot in that invisible backpack that for college students, and probably I would assume also for high school students, isn't directly involved for them. There's a fair number of questions or comments that have to do with property values and buying a home, and they're like 18 to 20, but inevitably students react very strongly to the Band-Aid, the idea that the Band-Aid is called skin tone. And that is almost always this like light bulb aha moment. And it's really, I don't want to oversimplify it. It is of course a much larger and much more complex conversation. But I think sometimes in our teaching, it's those little moments that we can use to open doors for students, and to then also have them be able to, we should be there as their teachers to support them. We should be there to walk with them through this, but they have to learn it themselves. Like they have to embody that learning. And if we can find something as seemingly innocuous as a Band-Aid, and that opens a door, let's do it. So I'm going to put the link to the one that I was trying to multitask a little bit, and I probably didn't do it very well, but hopefully this will give folks it's super easy to find, but that might be a way of sort of introducing the topic in a way that invites students to embody their learning of the process.
Anyone else want to chime in here? I was going to move into our last sort of segment in topics, but I don't want to stop the flow here.
Yeah, I'll say one other thing. If that's okay, Mickey.
Yes, please, Nolan.
I mean, I concur with a lot of what's been said, but going back to a point I made earlier that I think connects this well is that we have to talk about restructuring both our, when it comes to Walton's question, restructuring our education system and our political system. And to Allison's point, she talked about sneaking it in, and I think the resources she suggested are ones I use as well, and I would recommend them. But it shouldn't be a place where we have to sneak it in. It should be something where the system is built to already have these elements built. And we don't have that right now. So we need to restructure our education system to be less focused on job training and more about democracy. Democracy is defeating white supremacy. And so I think making that connection is key. And then politically, I would argue that we need to face it. I know we all hate it, but we do have two parties. And so we can rag on the Republicans. And since I've come to be the age of reason, it's been fun for me to do that. But the only other option is the Democrats. And so it takes a dramatic restructuring of them. And I know what Katie Halper and Brianna Joy Gray have referred to as woke washing, where they keep the status quo, but they put a diverse. I think we need to move the Democratic Party to take a much more structural approach, more anti-racist stance than these kind of like vapid signs of like virtue signaling and things like that.
Thanks, Nolan. We have a few minutes left in our scheduled allotment, and I do want to try to be somewhat mindful of the 4:30. We're shooting for 90 minutes here. We can obviously go a little bit over, but I just want to start winding up the discussion, the conversation. By the way, first of one of many, I think, that we're all going to be having this year. Project Censored is looking to be hosting a number of these types of events and conversations. And I know Nolan, you and some other folks are working on another critical media literacy conference of the Americas. So again, our panelists, if you would like to put any information, any links into the chat for all of the people here, please do that now. any of the participants. You've been sharing some great news and information and some sources yourself. Many, many thanks for that. We're all here to benefit each other and help each other. So Elizabeth, you kind of bring us right back around to media, right? All things media, and that's really what we're concerned about at Project Censored, media censorship. Manar Mahawish, who spoke first on social media deplatforming, had to leave early, but she definitely gave us some things to think about. And I noted somebody mentioned Whitney Webb, who's done stellar work, once for Mint Press, now on her own, very wonderful critical journalist. But you're right. Who owns the corporate media? Who owns these stations? And why are the same people getting the voice? In other words, who are the news makers? Who are the news shapers? We're back to the propaganda model. Sue Zipp, you mentioned about citizen journalism that Nick Baham was talking about. On one level, we wouldn't know so many things if it weren't for people with those devices in these places telling the stories that the corporate media and the establishment media won't tell. They're not interested in telling them. They don't even see them half the time or more. But of course, we also then have to go back to, well, what do we mean by media? What do we mean by journalism, right? And so I'm reminded in the current model, right, the corporate top-down establishment media model, you go back to 1964, Malcolm X in a stellar speech, which I urge people to read in its entirety because it's riveting and how timely and prescient it is. But he said, if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. And that's part of a much larger and more poignant speech. But if you go to the Society of Professional Journalists and you read what their ethics are, code of ethics, they want us to seek truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently, and be accountable and transparent. Is this really that hard? Well, I think the answer obviously is apparently it is, because the establishment corporate media seem to have all kinds of problems and challenges with this. But I'd like to toss out this last bit for people here, specifically as a more media related question, if we could. So I'd like to go through and give all of our panelists one more opportunity to take a couple minutes, have some concluding remarks for us. But also, tie in critical media literacy and the role of media and the kind of journalism we need moving forward out of the current crisis. Let's begin with you, Robin Anderson.
Yeah, I was just making a point on the chat. Someone asked about prosecutions. This morning, The Nation had Insurrection 2021 with Elie Mystal and Melissa Harris and a couple of other, and Eric Fromer. They were quite good. And Elie Mystal said, prosecution is the floor. We have to make these people accountable. It's not the ceiling. It's not where we're going to go. It's not the end all and be all, but it's the floor. It's the absolute least we can do. It's the start. And then they talked about not media literacy. I think we covered that topic here, but Melissa Harris is, of course, an educator. And she said she talked about we need to have civic high school lessons and teach people how to be citizens. And I think that media literacy is really important in doing that. And so those are all my only concluding remarks for this great panel and great discussion that I'm so grateful and honored to be part of. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Robin. Nick Baham, up to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to, before, as parting comments, I wanted to draw attention to some of Stephanie's important comments, clarifying comments. I don't want to leave this discussion with any impression that I've conflated what happened in the summer of 2020 with what happened in the storming of the Capitol. I do think that there's a difference between people who perceive a certain level of oppression versus people who are truly experiencing oppression. Neither do I really want to undermine, the real economic interests of everybody involved that we've talked about here. But certainly, as the grandson of a man who passed a lynching, it would not be proper for me to equate the interests of people who stormed the Capitol with the real interests of people who are involved in Black Lives Matter. And unfortunately, our media is engaged in some broad false equivalencies over this, let alone the fact that smashing a window for a target is not the same thing as invading the people's house. It simply isn't. But I do think that at some point in time, what I'm sort of guided by here is the work that Fred Hampton did before he was assassinated at the age of 20 by the FBI, who, by the way, we continue to laud in liberal left circles. And I think that that's a mistake. But Fred Hampton sought to bring together poor whites from outside of Chicago in rural Illinois with poor blacks in urban Chicago. And when I talk about truth and reconciliation, those are the kinds of meaningful dialogues we have to have. There is nothing that exists like that in our media. I think it's far too dangerous for anything like that to exist. But if we really want to have some progress on getting beyond the fog of neoliberalism, neoconservatism, neofascism, whatever, that's one way to do it, for us to have real talk with one another. And there are people who are engaged in this kind of real talk across this country. And I would just encourage that we push that further in Project Censored.
Thanks so much, Nick. And certainly with you along with us, you really help us keep that focus. So much appreciated. We're really grateful. We're all great, and we're grateful for all of the panelists and people here today. So up next, Allison Butler, commentary, taking us
so
here.
much. Yeah, I mean, I think my closing thought, first of all, this was amazing. I mean, this was so great. Thank you so much, Mickey, for herding all the cats, and Nolan for saying that this is something that we needed to do. And I certainly look forward to the day when we can all have this kind of conversation in person again. But yeah, I really appreciate it. I would say that my closing thoughts is about sort of climbing up and down the abstraction ladder, as it were. There was a couple of comments and some questions about media ownership. Certainly, Mickey, as you pointed out, this is a conversation that many of us have had so many times. But I think we start, at least in our classrooms with our students, we start in one direction by kind of climbing up that ladder and looking at ownership and distribution and production. Like, what is, there are a minimum number of companies. There is a maximum amount of profit from a very small number of people or corporations. We get presented in our homes with what seems like unlimited options, and yet not really when we start, climbing that ladder, but then also kind of climbing back down and looking inward. What is so appealing or horrifying to me, whoever the me is in this situation, about these media? Am I represented? And if so, how? Is the absence of my representation telling a story about who I am? I think we ask questions of self, and we ask questions of others. We ask questions internally, and we ask questions externally.
Thank you, Allison Butler. And again, it's an honor to work with you. And I hope that we'll be seeing more from you on some of these fronts, particularly around how critical media literacy is being used. Not critical, just straight up media literacy, and what the significant difference there is. I know you and Nolan have done a lot on that, and I'd love to have you on the show. In fact, would love to do an entire panel on that topic, because in the rise of all this so-called fake news era, there's those aerial quotes, I think people are adopting media literacy in a way that's uncritical and is being pushed more by corporate sources. And I think that needs to be really deconstructed. And I know you and Nolan have been doing a great job at that. I know Ben Boynton has, but I think that's coming up next. That might be one of the next things we need to be doing, because now there's so much attention on media literacy. I think people are ready to understand what the critical component really means and why it's such a significant part of critical pedagogy, critical race theory, and so forth. So thanks, Allison, for everything you do. Nolan, last but not least, Dr. Nolan Higdon, please wrap things up for us. I want to thank you on behalf of everyone for putting this together with us and instigating and really pushing us to have this. It's not always a fun conversation. I think it's an important conversation, and given sort of the shrugged shoulders and what's happening now from the talking heads in the corporate media, I think that we and the people in this forum, all the people participating here, all the folks out listening and typing their comments, I think we need to fill that void. Our voices need to be heard too, and all the voices of those that are being marginalized, that don't have platforms, really need to be heard and given opportunities to be heard. Nolan Higdon, your final remarks on today's events and the panel, please.
Yeah, I kind of echoing that. I want to thank everyone on the panel and Mickey for moderating it, and all the panelists for taking part. And I really do want to thank people for and those who are watching this video alerted. One of my closing remarks was to say that we need to remind ourselves that democracy is a full-time job, that we have to work 24 hours a day to strengthen our democracy. Part of that is defeating these hateful ideologies. Another part of it is finding fact-based information, and then also holding up institutions of democracy like journalism and education and things like that. And for too long, we've had sort of a sensibility in this country that, the people don't care, they won't participate. By showing up to conversations like this, people do demonstrate that they do care and they are interested. And I think having those moments is really important and a source of inspiration. I'd also like to say that we are all, advocates here for a critical approach to media literacy education. And that's because it helps people deconstruct content, that we don't want to tell people kind of what to think, but give them the tools how to analyze content. And we should take some comfort in knowing that the fake news ideologies behind Trump have been around for a long time. So it's not a new phenomenon, like we have no perspective on how to address it. We can look back, and I noticed some of the comments like Nick was talking about ham and things like that I think are helpful. As we look back at the past, though, too, we should also be, concerned about solutions like censorship and things like that. Terrified by big tech. I could care that they are shutting down Trump and Trump's rhetoric, but the precedent of this censorship by proxy, these are companies that have contracts with the federal government. They get loans from the federal government. There's a revolving door with members of the federal government. This is analogous to the Hollywood. Hollywood were independent institutions who worked with aspects of the federal government to censor people. So we should really be kind of concerned about that. And I think rather than go the censorship route, we should focus on critical media literacy. Let's give people the tools to break down these problems and hateful ideologies that have been around since the start of this country, and work tirelessly 24 hours a day to achieve that goal and strengthen our democracy.
Nolan, thanks so much for that really powerful conclusion and reminding us of the complexity of social media, media censorship in general. It's the 21st century. We're in the third decade. We've got a lot of work to do, and we've got a lot of catching up to do, because a lot of these big tech firms, big tech companies, they're far ahead of regulation. They're far ahead of the curve, and we really need to help educate not only each other, but the populace in general. I want to thank Robin Anderson, Allison Butler, Nolan Higdon, Nicholas Baham III, Manar Mahawish Adley. I want to thank all of you, and I have these brief concluding remarks. Nolan and I wrote a book called United States: A Distraction for City Lights in 2019. The subtitle, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America and What We Can Do About It. And I wanted to conclude with this following passage. It's strange how it's still so relevant today. What happens next is up to us, but time is of the essence. We still have the ability to make a difference by acting together, but act we must. In this new millennium, it's long past time for renewed and revelatory directions that favor the public sphere and restoration of the commons, or else we may find ourselves living in the ecologically unsustainable, corporate-dominated, authoritarian surveillance state toward which we've been heading for a long time. A better future is possible. To help change direction toward a more just and robust civil society, we need to build a non-commercial public media system and increase media literacy and critical pedagogy in schools. Doing so will help us better arm ourselves with the power that knowledge gives and enable us to give with greater deliberation, enable us to live with greater deliberation, democracy, and dignity. Hopefully with more equity, more inclusiveness, and more tolerance as well. I want to thank all of you. I want to thank all of the participants. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Mickey Huff, Director of Project Censored, and we'll see you the next round, the next conversation. Until then, stay well. I wish you all the best in 2021.